Well, hello everybody. This is Nils. Welcome to the live stream that I do every Monday night at 7:30 p.m. Pacific time. So, welcome to the stream today. Going to be talking about a few tips that I have about overcoming creative blocks. Now, why do you think this is important? Well, product managers are creative. That's just part of the nature of what we do. So, I'm going to give you three ideas that you can start using right away to overcome creative blocks you might have, and I'll actually explain what a few of these might be if you're a product manager. I personally use these ideas, some of them every day, all of them a lot, and I think that if you start using them right away, you will see immediate results if you are struggling with creativity. You know, not every product manager, I guess, struggles with creativity, just like not every writer has writer's block, at least according to a bunch of quotes that I looked at today about writer's block. What I found was that a lot of writers claim that they don't have it, but I actually think that most writers do suffer from writer's block, and they have different ways of getting over the writer's block. And in fact, a lot of the techniques are similar to the things that I'm going to share with you today. So, you know, product management is a pretty creative endeavor, and whether it's doing things like coming up with ideas for new products and features, or writing data sheets and release notes, or creating sales training, or doing sales training, or presenting new ideas for things that need to be funded by the executive team, or trying to improve the product management process in your organization. All of these things require often creating some kind of a presentation or some kind of a document, or coming up with a set of ideas that you can put into a form that you can create an argument from, all those sorts of things. And so I think that, at least for me, I find that not only is product management have a lot of other things as well, but a lot of what I have to do on a day-to-day basis as a product manager is be creative and come up with ideas and organize ideas and put them into a coherent form and put them into a presentable form and maybe put them onto paper or into a document. And so I find that a lot of times I'm faced with a problem and I have to do one of those things, and it becomes very challenging for me to make progress. And there's all kinds of reasons that you have creative blocks, whether it's fear or whether you don't know enough, whatever it might be. But the fact is that you are a creative person by creating. And if you're stuck on something, you have to come up with a way to continue to create, even if you're afraid or stuck in some way. And so that's what the techniques that I'm going to share with you are. And there's basically three different techniques. One of them is essentially just talking. Now, I find a lot of what I have to create is words on paper or words in a PowerPoint. And one of the things that I do often to overcome the blockage of creating the words on paper is to speak the words. And so actually it's one of the things that I do in these presentations on Monday nights is I go out and I put some words on a PowerPoint, and they're kind of sketchy, and then I just sort of riff on them. Now, sometimes that works out. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Now, for this particular presentation, I actually did a lot of riffing on the ideas behind it on the drive to work this morning. Now, another thing that you can do sometimes, and I find this helps me a lot, is if I have a big idea that I need to try to present or write about, that sometimes going into details really helps, and breaking down the concept into smaller concepts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And finally, there is this concept of activation energy. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's from physics or whatever, and it's about that sometimes processes take a lot of energy to get started, even though they don't necessarily take that much energy to keep going. And so a couple of the techniques I use are just meant to help me avoid or tunnel through that activation energy so that I get started with kind of not even knowing that I get started. I'll talk about my techniques for doing that. So first of all, let's talk about talking to people. So I have a couple of specific things that I do. Now, one of them is, and this actually, the way this often happens is kind of funny. Um, if I'm struggling over something, often for more than a day, and sometimes I don't even realize that I'm struggling, and my wife will say, "You seem to be having some struggle here. Tell me about it." And so what happens is I start talking to her. I start explaining the situation or the problem or the dilemma that I'm facing. And within usually literally 30 seconds, I have come up with a solution to the problem that has been bothering me for days, often, or sometimes weeks, even. Whatever the dilemma was, by talking about it out loud instead of just keeping it rolling around in my head, I was able to immediately come up with a solution. This also has to do with trying to explain it in terms that someone who's not in my domain would understand. Like my wife, she doesn't really know what I do on a day-to-day basis, which she shouldn't. And so I have to figure out how to describe the situation in a way that's accessible to somebody who's not in my domain. And that often is enough to break the concept free. Now, you can also often do this with a colleague, although you don't get the benefit of them not being in your domain, and so you having to simplify. And that can be a plus or a minus. Maybe sometimes the simplification isn't needed, and maybe all you need to do is to start talking and letting your brain and your mouth interact in a way that helps you solve the problem. Now, the other thing that I often do, and this is a little bit easier sometimes than finding someone to talk to, is I will create a basic PowerPoint about whatever it is that I'm trying to solve, and I'll go into an empty conference room and I will present that PowerPoint, maybe just sitting at my laptop, and I will start talking through it. And I will, as that happens, I will start to understand more about what is missing from what I have in my PowerPoint. It'll start raising objections in my brain that I realize I need to address if I want to make this become persuasive, or if I need to complete the argument or something like that. And so I will go, as I do this, I might go in and edit my PowerPoint a little bit and add some things and add slides and rearrange. And I find this is incredibly powerful. Now, one thing that's problematic, at least for me, in all of these talking-oriented ones, is that I really like to be in my head. Now, maybe this is a technologist thing, maybe it's just my own personality, but it requires some work on my part to get myself to make this move to start opening my mouth. And one of the techniques I've started to do is to do this on my drive to work. Instead of listening to a podcast, which I've been doing a lot of, I actually attack one of my topics that I need to make progress on. Now, this morning, it was actually this topic on overcoming creative blocks. And that's where I came up with the organization here. And I even came up with something really interesting, which I'll talk about on the next slide, because the next slide is really about drilling into details. Now, I find that drilling into details can often help me figure out things that I need to make sure to address when I am, presenting an argument or something like that. Now, I do this really in two ways. One is to use an outline, and I just put Microsoft Word into outline mode, and I just start typing and I rearrange and all that kind of stuff. The other thing I often use is a mind map, and I use a tool called MindNode. I've also used a free tool called FreeMind, which works pretty well for mind mapping. MindNode got good reviews, and so I decided to purchase it. And so you can see I've got a mind map here about product. This is about product management infrastructure. My screen's over here, so I have to kind of look at it to see what it says. But anyway, I came up with some ideas about how a product management organization might work in terms of having tooling, and that's a mind map. And so I tried to outline all the different ideas that might be associated to that. And then the outline there you can see is actually around my persuasion course that I'm working on. So how to be more persuasive when you do presentations. And so I've tried to capture all the different types of ideas that might be associated, in this case, with, for example, pre-handling objections, which is a fundamental tool in persuasion. So I've tried to get all those details out, and that will enable me to, it'll help me ensure that I'm covering all the topics that I need to cover, and that I'm not missing anything, and also that I am prepared to actually put the course together because I've written down all the topics, and then I can go back and look at that and say, well, did I really get everything? I might compare what I write in my outline to what other people talk about in a persuasion situation, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a really valuable tool. And it also just helps you organize your thoughts as well, because you can see in the course of the outline, is the argument going, is it coherent? Does it follow? Does one piece follow from another? One of the things that both mind maps and outlines don't do very well is to capture synergies, because they're very hierarchical. So in an outline, of course, you've got a high-level topic, and then under that, subtopics, and they really are sort of logically subordinate to the main topic. But if you have two topics that are sort of related in different parts of the outline, it's actually not very easy to indicate that within an outline. It's a little bit easier in a mind map, because a lot of these mind map tools, you can actually draw lines between different nodes, even if they're not directly related. So I was talking about in the car on the way to work this morning about mind maps and how I feel a little bit of discomfort about them because of this. And I realized, because I was talking, I came up with that word, synergy. And I thought, well, that's one of my problems with mind maps and with outlines. And then I thought, well, I can actually solve that problem. So because I was having this conversation, I was actually able to solve a fundamental problem that I've always had with mind maps, which is how to make them handle synergies better. So I just said, I can put a node on the mind map that's called synergies, and then just either, whenever I notice some things are related, I can either just put those as subnodes of the synergy node, or I can draw lines to them, draw other links and things like that. So the point is that in talking about creativity blockbusters during my drive to work, because I was preparing for this presentation, I came up with a creative solution to a problem that's been bothering me for a while. And I just thought that was really cool. So I wanted to share that with you. Okay, the next topic is how you tunnel through the activation barrier. This is the third key technique that I use. And I have one thing that's sort of like tunneling through the activation barrier, but what it is really practice in doing it. And that's what's called morning pages. Now, morning pages is a daily practice of writing. I actually write, well, you can see there that I got a little screenshot there. In July, I've actually so far written 28 out of 29 days. I just broke a 100-day streak. My longest streak is 440 days. And the reason I know these things is because I use this site called 750words.com. I'll put a link in the show notes so you don't have to remember that. But I use this site to do morning pages. Now, morning pages is a practice that's from a really great book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And so it's really focused on writing per se. Now, of course, as I said with product management, we're not just creative around writing. We have to do lots of different types of creativity. But I found morning pages to be really valuable in a couple different ways. The idea is that you, first thing in the morning, you just sit down at your desk with your cup of coffee and you write 750 words longhand in the book, and you just write whatever comes to mind. You're not doing an assignment. You don't care what it looks like. You can write, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write, over and over again, if that's all you can think of. And the goal is to overcome your self-editor, your internal self-editor, who's typically very cruel about your writing, and to just write and not let that cruel self-editor, internal editor, sort of stop you from writing. So that's how you start with morning pages. And then over time, you might start doing some other things with morning pages. In fact, Julia Cameron in the book initially says you don't even use these. You kind of throw them away. You don't refer back to them, certainly for the first 30 to 50 days. Now, I've been doing them for a decade and a half, something like that. I used to write them in longhand. Then I discovered 750words.com. I much prefer to type. And so now I've written something on the order of 3,000 days in the past 8 or 9 years, however long it's been. And I've written over 3 million words using on this site. It's kind of amazing. But the point is that I have a practice of writing, and I just get up and I do my writing, and I just write and write and write, and I don't care what it's going to be. Now, I'm at the point where I sometimes can give myself an assignment. So I might have a problem that I'm trying to solve, a creative problem, and I might give myself an assignment to try to write something about that in my morning pages. And 70% of the time, I get something good. 30% of the time, it doesn't work. So that's a useful thing to know. But the other thing is that oftentimes when I'm writing, irrespective of having an assignment, I will come up with some interesting ideas that then turn into blog posts or chapters of my book. My book is actually full of chapters that started out as morning pages. And so I either, I would cut them out, I'd copy them out, I'd put them in a document or into Evernote, and I'd do some polishing on them, and I'd extend them, and I'd add more, and so on and so forth. And I have a book, and a lot of the book came out of writing morning pages every day. So it really serves two purposes. One is that it does give me a way to create content and to solve problems if I sometimes give myself an assignment. But the other is that I've just become more natural and fluid about writing. It's easy for me to just sit down and start writing. Now, writing on the particular topic, sometimes that's a challenge. But just having the facility for writing, I do it every day. Almost every day. I miss a few. But I've just gotten better at that. So that is sort of a fundamental core practice that you can use and that I recommend to everybody. And I think product managers really need to be able to write well. And so practicing writing is a good way to get better at writing. And so I recommend doing morning pages, and you can do them longhand. I like using a system to do them so that it will count words for me and things like that. So that's a thing that I would highly recommend. Now, moving on though, let's actually talk about the act of getting through this, tunneling through this activation energy barrier. So the idea is that there's this big barrier that it's, for whatever reason, it's scary or whatever, it's hard to climb over that barrier to get started. Now, oftentimes when you get through that barrier, the sailing is relatively smoother. The effort required to keep going once you get started is less. And sometimes it turns out to be very little, because you might, once you get started, you often get into a state, at least I find this works for me. Once I get started, I get into a state of flow. That's that state of mind where things sort of seem easy and everything flows. And like for me, it's actually with morning pages, it sometimes happens to me after about 600 words. So I'm writing along and I need to write 750 words to maintain the streak. But oftentimes I find if I get to 600 words and then suddenly I look up again and I'm at 1,300 words. And I don't really notice the time having passed between 600 and 1,300. Right? So I wrote an additional 700 words without even noticing. Very quickly, things really flew. And oftentimes that's what turns into a blog post or an article or something like that. And that's because I get into flow. Now, the first 600 words usually are not very flowy. They're hard. They're difficult. And I just keep going because I know I have to keep going. And then in some magic way, I suddenly am moving fast. Now, that's what this idea of just 5 minutes. So there's another technique, a productivity technique called the Pomodoro technique. I'll put another link in to that. But the idea with the Pomodoro technique is you set a timer for 25 minutes and you work solidly for 25 minutes and then you take a 5-minute break and you do that over and over again. And so that can work, but I find it I don't like that one. And the reason is because it's really not the 25 minutes that's the problem. It's the first minute that's the problem. It's the problem is getting started on that 25-minute interval. It's not just doing the work for 25 minutes. If I get started and I get into it, I can do it for hours. And so what I instead do is I think about, well, let me just do 5 minutes on this. Let me do 5 minutes on this thing and just see what happens. And a surprising amount of times, that 5 minutes turns into an hour, again, without me really noticing it. And so I always try to remind myself that I can put 5 minutes of pain into this, and I give myself the permission to, if it remains painful and I don't make any progress, that I can stop and try again later. But the surprising number of times it actually turns into, yeah, that's where we're gonna go. Now, the final thing is to what I call preparing the space, which is okay, I don't know if I'm going to be creative today, but let me at least create the PowerPoint file. Now, I won't put anything in it, but let me at least create the file. So I open up PowerPoint, I say create new from template, and I put in the title of whatever it is I'm working on. And I just think, well, it's a placeholder title. It might not be the final title. Let me put that in. Oh, and actually there's a few ideas that I know I want to cover. So let me just put a couple bullet points in, and then at that point, once I've done that, I've made progress and I can stop. Now, what I often find when I do that, again, is that, I want to add a few more bullet points, and then maybe a few more, and then I start to think about, well, what about this topic and that topic? And then I say, you know what? I think what I really need to do is go back to what I started with, one of the examples, and I'm going to actually try presenting what I've got here and see how it sounds. And so then I do that talking practice where I present the PowerPoint to myself, and I think, oh, okay. And it's amazing how often just preparing the space with that first little very simple thing that doesn't require any risk taking from me, meaning I'm not really being creative at that point. I'm just creating a file. I'm just putting a few ideas in that aren't that creative. And sometimes that can just amazingly turn into, I'm always amazed, it can turn into a thing. And so I really highly recommend this idea of just getting started. So tunneling through this activation energy barrier is really about getting started in a way that doesn't require you to climb over the pain of the risk of rejection or having a bad idea. Just doing something really simple and straightforward and giving yourself permission to stop doing it if it's really painful. But it's to me surprising how often it ends up being just great. And you just keep going and you get into the flow state, and suddenly it's a half an hour later or an hour later and you've got a lot of good stuff done. So that's a thing that I like to recommend. So finally, let me just summarize. So the way to think about these things is, the first one about talking is really about changing modalities. So if what you're trying to do is write something, or you're trying to communicate something in a PowerPoint, oftentimes you can just talk about it, and your brain and your mouth will connect and do some things that your fingers and your brain can't quite do yet. And so I think that's a really powerful way to think about that. Then you can do the decomposition. This is the mind map, the outline. And oftentimes, one of the really good outcomes of that is that you discover things about the topic. You discover things either that you know that you didn't think you knew, or you discover places where you need to learn more because you can't fill in the mind map fully in that area. You also might discover connections that you didn't realize were there before, and that's that whole synergy piece. So that's really powerful capability. And then again, tunneling through the fear, which really is just about, well, let's get started. Let's do something very low risk to get started to begin with and see what happens. And if things just continue to happen, that's awesome. You can give yourself permission to stop if things don't happen. If you just continue to find resistance, you can give yourself permission to stop and then redo it in a different way. So those are really things that I use. I literally use these every day, these techniques. Well, I do the writing every day, as I mentioned, but I do the PowerPoint thing where I just create a PowerPoint and put some ideas in there that maybe have been floating around in my head, and then I might magically find myself presenting, and I might say, well, that sounds okay, or here's a piece that's missing, or I better talk about this other thing as well. And it magically, then I have a PowerPoint presentation about my topic, and it works very well. Now, the PowerPoint thing works, by the way, even if what your ultimate goal is a written thing. Because what you do is you create the PowerPoint, you think through everything, you use your brain and your sort of visual stuff to think through everything, and then once you've got it all thought through, then you can write it down, because at that point you're not creating anymore, you're just transcribing. And that's a little bit easier for your brain to take. And of course, as you do that, you're also going to be additionally creating and improving and organizing and stuff like that. But your brain is just thinking it's transcribing and editing, which is much easier for the brain to do than to create from the whole cloth. So that's a technique that I would recommend, even if your end goal is not a PowerPoint, but is maybe a document or a data sheet or whatever it might be. Okay, so those are the big topics. I hope that was interesting for you. Let me go back over here. Where's my mousey? There it is. Okay, so there I am. Now, If you hope you found this useful, let me know in the comments if you found this useful. If you want to see more from me, obviously I've got the YouTube channel, which is where you're watching this. I also have the book, and as I mentioned, a lot of the book came out of using techniques like this to create words on paper, electrons on whatever, electrons in the ether, that also became words on paper. You can get the actual book in actual paper if you like, and I think I'm always kind of amazed that happened. You can follow me on Twitter. I have the blog, secretpmhandbook.com/blog. Not too much action on the blog because I've been doing so much YouTube, but I will start to do a little bit more than that. The place where there is also action in addition to YouTube is the podcast. So the podcast is called All the Responsibility, None of the Authority, which of course is the mantra of product managers. And the site is alltheresponsibility.com, and you can go get the latest episodes. The most recent episode was related to storytelling. It was about the 2 stories that product managers should know how to tell. So you can go check that out on the blog if you go, or on the podcast if you go check that right now. And then already know the YouTube. So if you like this video, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel. There's a link in the show notes. You can just click that and it will subscribe you. It's kind of cool, a one-click subscribe. And also, if you found this interesting and maybe thought some of your colleagues might find it valuable, please share it with them. Also, click the like button. That really helps me out, helps other people find the videos as well. And I do like to get comments because, it's always nice to get feedback on whether this was good stuff, whether it was bad stuff, whether it was boring. Maybe you've heard all this before. Or if you find it valuable and you make use of it, I'd love to hear your results. That would be great. Anyway, that's about it for tonight's video. I thought it would be shorter, but they always end up a little longer than I expect them to be. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments, as I said, and I think without any further ado, I am going to sign off for now. Talk to you next week. Bye-bye.